You think you know what happened in those Victorian churches when marble saints began weeping blood? Of course you do. It's what everyone learned. Miraculous tears, divine interventions, faithful pilgrims gathering in awe. But tonight, while you're comfortable in your sanitized version of history, I'm going to show you what really happened behind those Gothic doors between 1850 and 1900. And when I'm finished, you'll never look at a religious statue the same way again. I've spent decades digging through archives that churches prefer to keep locked away. Parish records written in trembling hands, coroner reports buried in bureaucratic limbo, and personal letters that read like confessions from beyond the grave. What I found wasn't divine intervention. It was something far more human, far more calculated, and infinitely more disturbing than any supernatural explanation could ever be. Picture this: London, 1863. Saint. Bartholomew's Church stands like a stone giant against the perpetually gray sky. Inside, the air tastes of damp wool and desperate prayers. Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell kneels before a marble Madonna, her arthritic fingers clutching a rosary worn smooth by decades of anxiety. She's been coming here every morning for 3 months, ever since her husband died in one of those industrial accidents that the newspapers barely mention anymore. But this morning is different. This morning, the Madonna is crying, not the clear, clean tears of Hollywood movies or Sunday school paintings. These are thick, rust-colored tears that smell like copper pennies left in the rain. Mrs. Hartwell's scream echoes through the nave like a bird trapped in a cage, and within hours, half of London knows about the miracle at St. Bartholomew's. The crowds that gather aren't the peaceful congregations you might imagine. These are desperate people living in an age where cholera can kill your children in a day, where factory work turns men into shadows, where poverty isn't just an inconvenience but a death sentence. They come seeking miracles because medical science can't save them, because the government won't help them, because they have nowhere else to turn. What none of them know is that Father Marcus Whitmore has been expecting this day for months. Not because he's a prophet or a mystic, but because he's a very practical man with very specific problems. His church is drowning in debt, his congregation is shrinking as the Industrial Revolution pulls people toward newer neighborhoods, and the bishop has been making uncomfortable suggestions about closing smaller parishes. Whitmore isn't evil, not in the way we like to imagine villains. He's just desperate. And desperate men in positions of trust are capable of things that would horrify their former selves. He's discovered something that would make even the most cynical Victorian industrialist pause. The perfect way to manufacture hope in an age of despair. The secret isn't in ancient rituals or supernatural forces. It's in chemistry, metallurgy, and the kind of practical knowledge that any educated man of the period could acquire if he were motivated enough. Iron oxide mixed with glycerin creates a substance that looks exactly like blood when it oxidizes in contact with moisture. A small reservoir hidden inside a hollow statue, connected to nearly invisible copper tubing that runs through the marble's natural veins, can create tears that flow for hours. But the real genius isn't in the mechanism. It's in the timing. Whitmore has been studying his parishioners for years, learning their patterns, their needs, their breaking points. He knows Mrs. Hartwell comes every morning at 7:30. He knows she's been praying for a sign that her husband's suffering meant something. He knows exactly when to trigger his carefully constructed miracle. The blood that flows isn't random. It's scheduled, calibrated, designed to appear at moments of maximum psychological impact. When young Timothy Fletcher is dying of consumption, the statue weeps during his mother's vigil. When the coal miners are considering a strike that could destroy families, the Madonna sheds tears during their secret meetings in the church basement. Each miracle brings crowds, and crowds bring donations. Desperate people pay handsomely for hope, even hope that tastes like rust and smells like old metal. The church's finances recover within months. Property values in the surrounding area increase as pilgrims flock to witness divine intervention. Local businesses thrive on the sudden influx of visitors seeking spiritual healing. But here's where the story becomes truly disturbing. Other churches notice St. Bartholomew's miraculous recovery. Father Thompson at St. Mark's, Father Davidson at Holy Trinity, Father Mills at St. Catherine's. They all start asking careful questions about miraculous manifestations. Not because they're suspicious, but because they're equally desperate. What begins as one man's elaborate deception quickly becomes a network of clerical entrepreneurs sharing techniques and refining methods. They develop a vocabulary of coded language to discuss their activities. Spiritual maintenance refers to refilling the hidden reservoirs. Divine scheduling means timing the miracles for maximum impact. Blessing the mechanism is their euphemism for testing the flow rates and consistency of their manufactured blood. The Victorian era's obsession with scientific precision extends even to their religious fraud. They experiment with different chemical compositions to achieve various colors and consistencies. Some statues weep thin, watery blood that suggests recent wounds. Others produce thick, dark tears that imply ancient suffering. They learn that certain mixtures create blood that coagulates after exposure to air, leaving convincing stains that pilgrims can touch and photograph. Photography becomes their unexpected enemy and ally. While cameras can potentially expose their deception, they also provide permanent proof of miracles for skeptical donors and church authorities. The priests become amateur photographers, learning angles and lighting techniques that make their miracles appear even more dramatic and convincing. But every system designed by humans contains human flaws, and the network of bleeding statues carries within it the seeds of its own destruction. The priests begin competing with each other, escalating their miracles to attract larger crowds and bigger donations. What starts as simple tears evolves into more elaborate phenomena. Statues begin bleeding from wounds that appear overnight. Crucifixes start showing fresh stigmata. Holy water turns red during prayer services. The escalation attracts attention from unexpected quarters. Medical doctors begin studying the blood samples, finding chemical compositions that don't match human blood. Chemists discover traces of iron oxide and industrial compounds in the sacred tears. Photographers with advanced equipment notice details invisible to the naked eye. The tiny holes where tubing enters marble, the subtle discoloration around injection points, the mechanical precision of tear patterns that nature could never replicate. More disturbing still are the psychological effects on the congregations. People become addicted to miracles, requiring increasingly dramatic manifestations to maintain their faith. When the bleeding stops, even temporarily, some parishioners fall into despair deeper than their original suffering. Others become suspicious of any religious experience that doesn't include supernatural phenomena, rejecting the quiet comfort of traditional worship in favor of spectacular divine theater. The priests find themselves trapped in their own creation. They can't stop the miracles without destroying their congregation's faith and their church's financial stability, but they can't continue indefinitely without eventually being exposed. Some begin showing signs of what we would now recognize as severe anxiety and depression. Their private letters describe sleepless nights, constant fear of discovery, and a growing sense that they've committed sins that no amount of confession can absolve. But this story didn't die in Victorian London. The next time you see viral videos of weeping religious statues, remember Father Whitmore's careful chemical preparations, and notice how little human nature has changed, if it's changed at all. You think Father Whitmore's network was the end of it? That a handful of desperate priests bleeding statues for donations was as dark as this rabbit hole goes? Sweet, naive you. What I showed you was just the appetizer. Now, let me tell you about what happened when the bleeding statues started killing people. Birmingham, October 1867. Sarah Mitchell, age 23, mother of 2, dies screaming in agony after drinking water mixed with what she believed was miraculous blood from St. Andrew's weeping Christ. The official cause of death? Acute poisoning from copper sulfate contamination? But here's what the death certificate doesn't mention. Sarah was the 7th person to die that month from similar circumstances across 3 different parishes. The priests hadn't considered that their ingenious chemical mixtures would leach into the surrounding stonework, contaminating the holy water fonts positioned directly below their bleeding statue. Iron oxide, copper compounds, lead-based sealants, all perfectly safe when contained within marble veins, all potentially lethal when dissolved in water that desperate people drink, seeking miraculous cures. Father Whitmore receives the news about Sarah's death through a coded telegram that simply reads, "Seventh lamb lost. Shepherd Thompson seeks counsel." The network has developed its own language of guilt and horror, speaking in biblical metaphors to discuss industrial manslaughter. But Whitmore can't sleep anymore. His carefully maintained journal, discovered decades later in a hidden compartment, records his descent into what we'd now recognize as severe psychological breakdown. October 15th, 1867, Mrs. Mitchell's children came to service today. They don't know. They brought flowers for the Madonna that killed their mother. The boy, no more than 7, asked me if his mama was with the angels now. I told him yes. God forgive me, but what else could I say? That she died because I needed to pay for new roof slates? The network begins fracturing under the weight of unintended consequences. Some priests attempt to abandon their bleeding statues, but they discover something they never anticipated. Their congregations won't let them stop. People have become psychologically dependent on the miracles, interpreting any cessation as divine abandonment. When Father Davidson tries to seal the mechanisms at Holy Trinity, his parishioners riot, believing he's interfering with God's will. The situation escalates when Dr. Edmund Blackwood, a physician and amateur chemist, begins investigating the mysterious deaths. Unlike the bumbling investigators of Gothic novels, Blackwood is methodical, scientific, and absolutely ruthless in his pursuit of truth. He starts mapping the deaths, noting their proximity to churches with bleeding statues, analyzing the chemical composition of both the miraculous blood and the contaminated holy water. Blackwood's findings are devastating. The iron oxide mixtures aren't just poisoning water supplies, they're creating toxic environments that affect everyone in the churches differently. Children and elderly parishioners show signs of chronic metal poisoning, neurological symptoms, digestive issues, and respiratory problems that worsen with prolonged exposure. The very people seeking divine healing are being slowly murdered by the faith they trust. But here's where Victorian society's hypocrisies create a perfect storm of institutional cover-up. The Church of England can't afford a scandal about fraudulent miracles and poisoned parishioners. not when they're already competing with evangelical movements and dealing with growing scientific skepticism. Local authorities depend on church support for social services and moral authority. Wealthy donors who've contributed to miracle churches would lose face if their spiritual investments were exposed as elaborate frauds, so they all conspire to bury the truth. Death certificates list vague causes: consumption, weak constitution, natural causes. Dr. Blackwood finds his research funding mysteriously withdrawn. Newspaper editors receive visits from well-dressed men who suggest that certain stories might not be in the public interest. Surviving family members of poison victims receive unexpected financial assistance, along with gentle suggestions that legal action might prove complicated. The network adapts, evolves, becomes something far more sophisticated and sinister. They recruit Dr. Marcus Thornfield, a disgraced physician with gambling debts and flexible ethics, to help them develop safer chemical formulations. Thornfield doesn't just solve their poisoning problem, he revolutionizes their entire operation with insights that would make modern pharmaceutical companies envious. Thornfield discovers that timing miraculous manifestations with specific psychological states dramatically increases their effectiveness. Statues now weep during funerals, maximizing emotional impact when families are most vulnerable. Crucifixes bleed during sermons about suffering and redemption. Holy water develops mysterious healing properties during prayer services for the desperately ill. More disturbing still, Thornfield begins experimenting with what he calls graduated miraculous response. Congregations are psychologically conditioned through increasingly dramatic supernatural phenomena. It starts with simple tears, progresses to bleeding wounds, escalates to voices heard during prayer, and culminates in full-scale apparitions created through clever lighting, hidden speakers, and chemical-induced hallucinations from incense mixed with mild psychoactive compounds. The priests become dealers in manufactured transcendence, understanding their congregation's psychological profiles better than any modern therapist. They maintain detailed records of individual parishioners' spiritual needs, family tragedies, financial situations, and emotional vulnerabilities. These records, written in coded language, read like intelligence files compiled by spiritual surveillance experts. Mrs. Pemberton, husband deceased 6 months, 3 children under 10, desperate for sign of afterlife, responds strongly to maternal imagery, tears during Ave Maria, potential monthly donation capacity, £2, 4 shillings, optimize Madonna tears for Sunday morning appearances. But the most chilling aspect of Thornfield's involvement isn't his technical innovations, it's his research into what he terms spiritual addiction patterns. What were it? He documents how people become physiologically dependent on religious experiences, requiring increasingly dramatic manifestations to achieve the same emotional satisfaction. He maps the neurological pathways of faith, treating religious belief like a drug addiction that can be manipulated, controlled, and exploited. The network expands beyond London, establishing bleeding statue operations throughout England, Wales, and Ireland. They develop regional variations adapted to local cultures and superstitions. Irish churches feature weeping Virgin Marys that respond to political oppression. Welsh chapels showcase bleeding Celtic crosses during mining disasters. Scottish parishes display stigmatic saints during Highland clearances. Each regional operation feeds intelligence back to the central network, creating a database of human suffering and spiritual desperation that spans the British Isles. They track economic conditions, social unrest, political tensions, and natural disasters, timing their miracles to capitalize on communal trauma and uncertainty. The financial success exceeds their wildest expectations. Churches report donation increases of 300 to 500%. Property values around miracle sites skyrocket as pilgrimage tourism develops. Local businesses create entire economies around supernatural phenomena. Hotels for visiting pilgrims, shops selling blessed relics, restaurants serving miraculous meals. But success breeds paranoia and competition within the network itself. Priests begin sabotaging each other's operations, introducing defective chemicals that cause rival churches' miracles to fail embarrassingly during important services. Anonymous letters are sent to church authorities, reporting suspicious activities at competing parishes. Some priests hire private investigators to gather blackmail material on their colleagues. Dr. Blackwood, meanwhile, hasn't given up his investigation despite institutional obstacles. He's been quietly building a case, collecting evidence, mapping connections, and documenting the network's operations with scientific precision. His private laboratory contains samples of miraculous blood from dozens of churches, chemical analyses that prove systematic fraud, and correspondence that reveals the conspiracy's scope. Blackwood's breakthrough comes when he obtains Father Whitmore's journal through a disgruntled church employee who can no longer stomach the deception. The journal provides detailed documentation of the network's formation, operations, and casualties. But more importantly, it reveals something that horrifies even Blackwood's scientific skepticism. The priests have begun believing their own miracles. Prolonged exposure to manufactured supernatural phenomena, combined with the psychological stress of maintaining elaborate deceptions, has created a form of collective delusion among the network's leadership. They've started interpreting coincidences as divine intervention, viewing their success as proof of God's approval, and believing that their poisoning victims were somehow chosen for martyrdom. Father Whitmore's final journal entries read like dispatches from a man losing his grip on reality. The Madonna spoke to me last night, not through the mechanisms, but truly spoke. She told me the deaths are necessary sacrifices, that we are instruments of divine will. She showed me visions of the pure church we are creating, cleansed of weak faith and false believers. The psychological deterioration spreads through the network like a contagion. Priests begin seeing visions during their own manufactured miracles. They interpret technical malfunctions as supernatural interventions. They start believing that their chemical formulations are divinely inspired, that their timing is guided by angelic whispers, that their victims died because God willed their sacrifice. Dr. Blackwood realizes he's no longer investigating simple fraud. He's documenting the birth of a cult, a religious movement founded on systematic deception that has evolved into genuine fanaticism. The bleeding statues have become more than financial scams. They're psychological weapons that have turned their creators into believers in their own manufactured mythology. But the network's delusions are about to collide with Victorian England's emerging scientific rationalism, investigative journalism, and legal reforms. The collision, when it comes, will destroy more than just fraudulent miracles. It will shatter faith itself in ways that still echo through modern religious institutions. The blood that flows through marble veins is about to become very, very real. And next time you wonder why people still fall for obvious scams, remember Father Whitmore's journal. The human capacity for self-deception is the only miracle that never needs manufacturing. You want to know what happens when an entire religious system built on manufactured miracles finally collapses? When the carefully constructed illusions shatter and leave thousands of believers staring into an abyss of their own making? Let me tell you about the winter of 1871, when Dr. Blackwood's investigation exploded into the most devastating religious scandal in Victorian history. It begins with a child. 7-year-old Margaret O'Sullivan, daughter of Irish immigrants, dies in convulsions after her desperate mother feeds her holy water from St. Patrick's Weeping Madonna. Unlike the previous victims, Margaret's death occurs during Sunday Mass in front of 200 witnesses, including a visiting journalist from The Times who happens to be documenting Irish immigrant religious practices. The journalist, Harold Finch, isn't particularly religious or skeptical. He's just a competent reporter doing a routine human interest story. But Margaret's death unfolds before his eyes like a medical horror show. The child's violent seizures, her mother's screams of confusion and betrayal, the congregation's stunned silence as their miracle literally kills a believer during worship. Finch's article, published 3 days later, doesn't accuse anyone of fraud. It simply describes what he witnessed with brutal clinical precision. The miracle that murdered. A child's death in God's house becomes the match that ignites a firestorm of public scrutiny that the network can no longer contain or redirect. Dr. Blackwood seizes the moment, releasing his accumulated evidence to multiple newspapers simultaneously. Chemical analyses proving systematic fraud, death certificates linked to miraculous phenomena, financial records showing impossible donation increases, and most damning of all, excerpts from Father Whitmore's journal revealing the network's existence and operations in the priest's own words. The public reaction exceeds even Blackwood's expectations. This isn't just about religious fraud, it's about authority, trust, and the very foundations of Victorian moral order. If the Church of England's priests are deliberately poisoning their congregations while manufacturing fake miracles for profit, what other institutions are lying? What other authorities are exploiting public trust for personal gain? The scandal spreads through London society like cholera through a slum. Wealthy donors discover they've been financing elaborate schemes to defraud the poor. Church authorities realize their oversight has enabled systematic murder disguised as ministry. Government officials understand they've helped cover up industrial manslaughter committed by religious leaders. But here's where the story becomes truly devastating. The network doesn't simply confess and apologize. Instead, they double down on their delusions, claiming that God is testing their faith through persecution, that the deaths were divine sacrifices, that their accusers are agents of Satan trying to destroy true Christianity. Father Whitmore, now completely detached from reality, holds a press conference that reads like a transcript from a madhouse. Standing before his bleeding Madonna, he declares that the statue has been speaking to him directly, revealing apocalyptic visions of a purified church rising from the ashes of corrupted institutions. He drinks a cup of the contaminated holy water on camera, daring God to strike him down if his miracles are false. Whitmore collapses within minutes, convulsing in the same agony as his victims. But his followers interpret his poisoning as martyrdom rather than exposure. The sight of their leader dying from his own deception somehow strengthens rather than weakens their faith in manufactured miracles. They've become psychologically incapable of accepting evidence that contradicts their invested beliefs. The network fragments into increasingly fanatical splinter groups. Some priests flee to remote parishes, continuing their bleeding statue operations in secret. Others escalate their phenomena, creating increasingly dramatic and dangerous spectacles to prove their divine mandate. A few suffer complete psychological breaks, found wandering the streets, claiming to be biblical figures, or speaking in tongues that are actually chemical-induced neurological damage. Dr. Thornfield, the network's scientific architect, attempts to escape accountability by publishing a detailed confession that shifts blame to his religious colleagues. His memoir, The Manufacture of Faith, A Scientist's Journey into Ecclesiastical Fraud, becomes a bestseller that horrifies and fascinates Victorian readers with its clinical descriptions of psychological manipulation techniques. But Thornfield's confessions reveal something more disturbing than simple fraud. His research into spiritual addiction patterns has documented how entire communities can become psychologically dependent on supernatural experiences, creating populations of people who literally cannot function without regular doses of manufactured transcendence. The congregations of bleeding statue churches exhibit symptoms that modern psychology would recognize as collective withdrawal, depression, anxiety, inability to find meaning in ordinary worship, desperate seeking for new miraculous experiences. Some parishioners travel obsessively from church to church, chasing increasingly exotic supernatural phenomena. Others fall into despair so profound that suicide rates in affected parishes increase dramatically. More disturbing still are the children raised in these environments. Young people who grew up expecting regular miracles as normal parts of religious life find themselves psychologically unable to accept traditional faith. They've been conditioned to equate authentic spirituality with spectacular supernatural events, making them either vulnerable to future manipulation or completely unable to maintain religious belief at all. The legal consequences prove almost impossible to navigate. How do you prosecute priests for murders they committed while genuinely believing they were serving God? How do you hold church authorities accountable for oversight failures when they were also victims of elaborate deceptions? How do you seek justice for poisoning victims when many of their families still believe their deaths were divinely ordained sacrifices? The court proceedings become grotesque theater as defense attorneys argue that their clients are insane rather than criminal, that prolonged exposure to their own manufactured supernatural phenomena has destroyed their ability to distinguish between reality and delusion. Psychiatrists testify about induced religious psychosis, chemical brain damage from toxic exposure, and mass hysteria effects on closed religious communities. Father Davidson, one of the few network members who maintains some grip on reality, provides the most chilling testimony. Under oath, he describes how the bleeding statue operations gradually transformed their creators. We began as desperate men seeking to save our churches. We became merchants of false hope. And finally, we became believers in our own merchandise. The statues didn't just weep blood, they wept away our sanity. The trials reveal the full scope of the network's operations. 47 churches across Britain and Ireland, an estimated 300 deaths from poisoning, thousands of people suffering chronic health effects from chemical exposure, and financial fraud totaling over £50,000 in modern currency equivalent. But the most devastating evidence comes from the network's own records. Their detailed psychological profiles of parishioners, their systematic exploitation of grief and desperation, their calculated timing of miracles to maximize emotional manipulation, these documents, read like manuals for spiritual warfare, conducted against their own congregations. Public faith in religious institutions collapses with stunning speed. Church attendance drops by 30% across England within 2 years. Donations to religious charities plummet as people question whether their contributions are funding legitimate ministry or elaborate scams. Enrollment in theological seminaries falls dramatically as potential priests fear association with a profession now synonymous with fraud and murder. The Catholic Church, initially smug about Protestant scandals, quickly discovers that several of their own parishes have been operating similar schemes. The practice of bleeding statues, it turns out, isn't denominationally exclusive. Desperation and greed transcend theological differences, creating an ecumenical conspiracy of manufactured miracles that spans religious boundaries. International investigations reveal bleeding statue networks in France, Germany, Italy, and even the United States. What began as a uniquely English phenomenon of Victorian religious fraud has become a global industry of spiritual manipulation. Churches worldwide are forced to examine their own miraculous claims, leading to a crisis of credibility that affects religious institutions across continents. The scientific community responds with cold satisfaction to religion's self-inflicted wounds. This is the age of Darwin, of geological deep time, of empirical methodology challenging supernatural explanation. The bleeding statue scandal provides perfect ammunition for those arguing that religious faith is inherently opposed to rational thought and ethical behavior. Dr. Blackwood becomes a celebrity, touring lecture halls to explain his investigation and promote scientific skepticism towards supernatural claims. His presentations draw massive audiences hungry for rational explanations of mysterious phenomena. But even Blackwood is disturbed by the public's eagerness to abandon all religious faith rather than simply demanding better evidence for extraordinary claims. The social consequences ripple through Victorian society in ways no one anticipated. Charitable work previously organized by churches collapses as congregations disband or lose funding. Moral education programs disappear along with religious institutions. Social services provided by parish networks evaporate, leaving the poor and vulnerable without traditional support systems. Crime rates increase in areas where religious institutions provided community structure and moral guidance. Alcoholism spreads as people seek chemical alternatives to the manufactured transcendence they've lost. Suicide rates climb among former believers, unable to find meaning in a universe suddenly stripped of divine intervention. The bleeding statue scandal doesn't just destroy fraudulent miracles, it creates a spiritual vacuum that Victorian society struggles to fill. People who built their entire worldviews around regular supernatural experiences find themselves adrift in a universe that seems suddenly cold, mechanical, and meaningless. But here's the most disturbing aspect of the entire collapse. Within 5 years, new religious movements begin appearing that promise even more dramatic supernatural experiences than the bleeding statues ever provided. The human need for transcendence, once satisfied by manufactured miracles, seeks increasingly exotic outlets. The network's psychological research into spiritual addiction patterns becomes a roadmap for future religious manipulators. Thornfield's documentation of how to create and exploit faith-based dependencies inspires generations of charismatic leaders, cult founders, and spiritual entrepreneurs who understand that manufactured transcendence is always more powerful than authentic faith. And when you see modern congregations swaying to emotional music, speaking in tongues, or chasing miracle healing services, remember Father Whitmore's final journal entry: sometimes the most dangerous lies are the ones we desperately want to believe, especially when they're designed by people who understand exactly how desperate we really are. You think the bleeding statue scandal ended with trials and confessions? That Victorian society learned its lesson about manufactured miracles and moved on to rational enlightenment? Oh, sweet naive you. What I'm about to show you is how the network's survivors didn't just escape justice. They evolved, adapted, and created something far more sophisticated than bleeding marble could ever be. Meet Reverend Jonathan Ashford, former associate of Father Whitmore, one of the few network members who avoided prosecution by destroying evidence and disappearing before the investigations reached his parish. By 1875, he's established himself in the American frontier under a new identity, armed with 4 years of practical experience in psychological manipulation and Dr. Thornfield's research into spiritual addiction patterns. Ashford's genius lies in recognizing the bleeding statue's fundamental flaw. They were too obviously mechanical, too dependent on physical evidence that could be analyzed and exposed. Instead, he focuses on phenomena that exist purely in the realm of human consciousness: visions, voices, prophecies, and healing experiences that leave no chemical traces or physical evidence. The American frontier provides perfect hunting grounds for this evolved form of spiritual manipulation. Isolated communities, desperate settlers facing harsh conditions, limited education, and minimal oversight from established religious authorities create ideal environments for experimental ministry techniques. Ashford establishes the Church of Divine Manifestations in a small Nebraska town, promising direct communication with the divine without any messy bleeding statues. His methods are breathtakingly sophisticated compared to the crude chemical tricks of the Victorian network. Ashford uses carefully orchestrated group psychology, strategic sleep deprivation during extended prayer services, controlled breathing techniques that induce altered states of consciousness, and subtle environmental manipulations, lighting, temperature, sound, that create perfect conditions for religious experiences that feel completely authentic to participants. But Ashford's most diabolic innovation is his systematic study of individual psychological vulnerabilities. Unlike the Victorian priest's general exploitation of desperation, he maintains detailed psychological profiles of every congregation member, tracking their personal traumas, family histories, financial pressures, and emotional needs with the precision of a modern therapist building treatment plan. His congregation records, discovered decades later in a farmhouse basement, read like a predator's hunting manual disguised as pastoral care notes. Martha Henderson, lost infant son last winter, guilt over survival during difficult birth, responds strongly to messages about children's souls in paradise, potential for substantial land donation if properly guided through grief counseling sessions. Ashford perfects what he calls customized revelation, prophetic visions and divine messages specifically tailored to each individual's psychological profile and current life circumstances. Widows receive detailed descriptions of their deceased husband's happiness in heaven. Struggling farmers get prophecies about upcoming abundant harvests. Parents of difficult children hear divine reassurances about their offspring's future redemption. The technique requires incredible preparation and intelligence gathering. Ashford employs congregation members as unwitting spies, encouraging them to share personal struggles during group prayer sessions, while he takes mental notes for future, divinely inspired messages. He studies local newspapers, court records, and business transactions to gather information that he can later present as supernatural knowledge. The psychological impact exceeds anything the Bleeding Statue Network ever achieved. People don't just believe in Ashford's miracles. They experience them as personal communications from God specifically addressed to their individual situation. The sense of divine attention and care becomes psychologically addictive in ways that generic bleeding statues could never match. More disturbing still, Ashford discovers that people who receive customized revelations become evangelical recruiters for his techniques. They share their extraordinary experiences with friends and family members, providing testimonials more convincing than any advertisement. Each satisfied customer becomes an unpaid marketing agent spreading word of Ashford's miraculous abilities. Within 5 years, Ashford's Nebraska church grows from 12 founding members to over 300 regular attendees, with satellite congregations in 4 surrounding states. He's developed a training program for other ministers, teaching his psychological manipulation techniques under the guise of advanced pastoral counseling methods. But Ashford's network differs fundamentally from the chaotic Victorian bleeding statue conspiracy. Instead of competing priests undermining each other, he creates a hierarchical organization with centralized training, standardized techniques, and careful quality control. His disciples don't just copy his methods, they refine and improve them through systematic experimentation on their own congregations. The network maintains detailed research records, documenting which psychological manipulation techniques work most effectively on different personality types, age groups, and social circumstances. They develop specialized approaches for widows, war veterans, immigrants, struggling farmers, and childless couples. Each demographic receives targeted spiritual experiences designed to maximize emotional impact and financial contribution. Dr. Marcus Thornfield, the disgraced scientist from the Victorian network, resurfaces as Ashford's research consultant under an assumed name. His expertise in neurological effects of religious experiences proves invaluable in developing techniques that trigger genuine altered states of consciousness without chemical intervention. Thornfield's new research focuses on environmental factors that induce religious experiences, specific sound frequencies, lighting patterns, architectural designs, and group dynamics that reliably produce mystical states. Together, Ashford and Thornfield create what they term experiential faith architecture. Church buildings, service structures, and community organizations designed to maximize psychological vulnerability and spiritual dependency. Every element, from seating arrangements to hymn selections to sermon timing, is calibrated to produce optimal conditions for manufactured transcendence. Their innovations spread rapidly through American frontier religious communities. Circuit preachers carry Ashford's techniques across the continent, establishing churches that appear completely different on the surface but operate according to identical psychological manipulation principles. Baptist congregations in Texas, Methodist revival meetings in Oregon, and Presbyterian settlements in California all unknowingly employ variations of techniques developed by survivors of the Victorian bleeding statue scandal. The network's expansion reveals something terrifying about human psychology. People don't just want to believe in miracles, they need to believe in miracles. The spiritual vacuum left by declining traditional religious authority creates desperate hunger for transcendent experiences that sophisticated manipulators can systematically exploit. Ashford's research documents how entire communities become psychologically dependent on his manufactured spiritual experiences. Towns that host his revival meetings show dramatically increased church attendance, higher religious donations, and stronger community cohesion. But they also exhibit signs of what modern psychology would recognize as collective addiction. Inability to maintain spiritual satisfaction without regular doses of manufactured transcendence, increased susceptibility to other forms of manipulation, and aggressive hostility toward anyone who questions their religious experiences. More disturbing still, second-generation members, children raised in Ashford's communities, show psychological profiles distinctly different from their parents. They exhibit what Thornfield terms manufactured spirituality syndrome, inability to experience genuine religious emotion without external manipulation, constant seeking for increasingly dramatic spiritual experiences, and complete inability to distinguish between authentic and manufactured transcendence. The network begins experimenting with what they call hereditary spiritual dependency, techniques designed to ensure that children raised in their communities will require their services for life. Young people are systematically conditioned to associate spiritual satisfaction with specific environmental triggers and psychological manipulations that can only be provided within network churches. By 1885, Ashford's organization operates over 200 churches across 17 states, with an estimated 50,000 regular attendees and a sophisticated training academy that graduates new ministers every year. They've created a religious industrial complex based on systematic psychological exploitation disguised as spiritual ministry. But success breeds its own problems. The network's rapid expansion attracts attention from established religious authorities, investigative journalists, and government officials concerned about potential fraud. Unlike the isolated Victorian bleeding statue operations, Ashford's organization has become too large and successful to operate in secrecy. The Catholic Church launches a formal investigation into Protestant miracle claims, suspicious of theological innovations that seem designed to compete with traditional Catholic mysticism. Established Protestant denominations begin questioning churches that report unusually high conversion rates and donation levels. Academic researchers start studying communities with exceptional religious activity, seeking to understand the psychological and social factors behind spiritual revival movements. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, a pioneering psychologist studying religious experiences, begins documenting patterns in communities that report high levels of spiritual activity. Her research, conducted independently of any investigation into fraud, reveals disturbing similarities between different revival movements, identical psychological manipulation techniques, suspiciously similar divine revelation pattern, and community dependency structures that resemble addiction models more than healthy religious practice. Morrison's academic papers don't accuse anyone of deliberate deception, but they document the systematic use of psychological manipulation techniques in religious contexts with scientific precision. Her work provides a theoretical framework for understanding how manufactured spiritual experiences can be distinguished from authentic religious phenomena, creating tools that investigators can use to identify potential fraud operations. The network faces a dilemma identical to their Victorian predecessors. They can't abandon their techniques without losing their congregations, but they can't continue operating without eventually being exposed by increasingly sophisticated investigation methods. Some ministers attempt to transition toward more traditional religious practices, only to discover that their communities cannot function without regular doses of manufactured transcendence. Ashford himself begins showing signs of the same psychological deterioration that destroyed Father Whitmore. Prolonged immersion in manufactured spiritual experiences, combined with the stress of maintaining elaborate deceptions, creates what Thornfield documents as synthetic spirituality psychosis, inability to distinguish between genuine and manufactured religious experiences in his own consciousness. His private journals reveal a man losing touch with reality in ways that mirror his Victorian predecessors. The visions I provide to my congregation have begun appearing to me during private prayer. God speaks to me now with the same words I place in other people's mouths. Either I have become a true prophet, or I have become completely insane. The difference seems irrelevant when the results are identical. But here's the most chilling aspect of the network's evolution. They've documented their techniques so thoroughly that their methods can survive their creators' psychological destruction. Unlike the chaotic collapse of the Victorian bleeding statue conspiracy, Ashford's organization has created systematic training programs, detailed operational manuals, and institutional structures that can function independently of any individual leader's sanity. The techniques developed by survivors of Victorian religious fraud have evolved into something more dangerous than their origins, a self-perpetuating system for manufacturing spiritual dependency that can adapt, spread, and survive across generations. The bleeding statues were just the beginning. And next time you wonder why people join cults or fall for charismatic religious leaders, remember Reverend Ashford's congregation records. The most effective spiritual manipulation doesn't involve obvious tricks or dramatic miracles. It involves making people believe their deepest personal experiences are divinely orchestrated just for them. You think Ashford's network stayed confined to frontier churches and isolated communities? That mainstream religious institutions remained pure while con artists played with manufactured miracles on the margins? Let me shatter that comfortable delusion and show you how the techniques perfected by bleeding statue survivors infiltrated the very heart of established Christianity, creating the foundation for every modern religious manipulation you see today. By 1890, graduates of Ashford's training academy have quietly integrated into respectable denominations across America and Europe. These aren't obvious cult leaders or fringe preachers. They're Methodist ministers, Presbyterian pastors, Baptist reverends, and even Catholic priests, who carry with them sophisticated psychological manipulation techniques disguised as enhanced pastoral care methods. The infiltration succeeds because the techniques appear beneficial rather than exploitative. Ministers trained in Ashford's methods demonstrate remarkable abilities to comfort grieving families, inspire struggling congregations, and create powerful religious experiences that increase church attendance and donations. Church authorities don't question success. They celebrate it and promote the ministers responsible. Reverend Thomas Kellerman, an Ashford graduate working in a prestigious Philadelphia Methodist church, exemplifies this successful integration. His congregation grows from 200 to over 800 members within 3 years. His services are described in local newspapers as spiritually transformative and divinely inspired. Wealthy donors compete to fund his ministry expansion. Church leadership considers him a model for modern pastoral excellence. What they don't see are Kellerman's private files containing detailed psychological profiles of every congregation member, their financial situations, family dynamics, personal traumas, and spiritual vulnerabilities. His sermons aren't divinely inspired. They're carefully crafted psychological operations designed to trigger specific emotional responses in targeted individuals within his audience. Kellerman's Sunday morning service follows a precise psychological manipulation protocol developed through decades of experimentation on human spiritual needs. The opening hymns are selected to induce specific brainwave states. The lighting and temperature are adjusted to maximize emotional vulnerability. His sermon topics are chosen based on analysis of recent community events, personal crises among congregation members, and seasonal psychological patterns that affect spiritual receptivity. But here's the truly insidious aspect of mainstream infiltration. These techniques become standard practices that get passed down through normal ministerial training without anyone understanding their psychological manipulation origins. Young seminarians learn Kellerman's methods as effective pastoral techniques without knowing they're being taught systematic spiritual exploitation disguised as ministry education. The Methodist Church begins incorporating Ashford-derived techniques into their official ministerial training curriculum. Presbyterian seminaries start teaching enhanced spiritual counseling methods that are direct descendants of Victorian bleeding statue psychological research. Baptist colleges develop community engagement strategies based on principles of manufactured spiritual dependency originally designed to exploit desperate frontier settlers. Dr. Morrison's academic research into religious psychology, meanwhile, has attracted attention from an unexpected quarter: the emerging field of advertising and mass marketing. Business leaders studying her documentation of religious manipulation techniques realize these same psychological principles can be applied to commercial sales, political campaigns, and social movements. The cross-pollination between religious manipulation and commercial advertising creates a feedback loop that accelerates the sophistication of both fields. Techniques developed to manufacture spiritual experiences get adapted for selling products, while marketing innovations get incorporated into religious manipulation methods. The boundary between spiritual exploitation and consumer manipulation disappears entirely. By 1895, major American corporations are employing former ministers trained in Ashford's methods as advertising consultants. Political parties recruit graduates of infiltrated seminaries to design campaign strategies. Social reform movements unknowingly adopt psychological manipulation techniques originally developed to exploit religious faith for financial gain. The techniques spread internationally through missionary work and religious conferences. European churches, hosting American revival meetings, unknowingly import sophisticated manipulation methods along with evangelical enthusiasm. British religious institutions, still reeling from the bleeding statue scandals, embrace American spiritual renewal techniques without recognizing their connection to the Victorian fraud networks they've tried to forget. Catholic authorities, initially resistant to Protestant innovations, begin adopting modified versions of these techniques after observing their effectiveness in competing denominations. The psychological manipulation methods get filtered through traditional Catholic theology and ritual, creating hybrid approaches that combine ancient religious symbolism with modern psychological exploitation. Father Giuseppe Marchetti, studying at the Gregorian University in Rome, writes his doctoral thesis on enhanced pastoral psychology in modern ministry, unknowingly documenting how Ashford-derived techniques can be integrated with Catholic sacramental theology. His work becomes required reading for Catholic seminarians across Europe, spreading manipulation techniques throughout the Catholic Church under the guise of improving pastoral care. The most disturbing development is how these techniques begin affecting children's religious education. Sunday school curricula, youth ministry programs, and religious boarding schools start incorporating psychological manipulation methods designed to create lifelong spiritual dependency. Children as young as 5 are systematically conditioned to associate authentic emotional experiences with manufactured religious stimuli. Dr. Sarah Whitefield, no relation to the Victorian Father Whitmore, a pioneering child psychologist, begins documenting concerning patterns in children from highly religious families. Her case studies describe young people who cannot experience genuine emotions without religious context, who exhibit anxiety disorders when separated from church environments, and who show symptoms resembling addiction withdrawal when unable to attend regular religious services. Whitefield's research reveals something horrifying. The techniques originally developed to exploit adult spiritual desperation have been adapted to shape developing childhood psychology in ways that create permanent psychological dependency on religious manipulation. These children grow up incapable of distinguishing between authentic spiritual experiences and manufactured emotional manipulation. More disturbing still, second and third generation victims begin displaying what Whitefield terms inherited manipulation tolerance, psychological resistance to standard emotional manipulation that requires increasingly sophisticated techniques to achieve the same effects. Religious leaders find themselves needing to constantly escalate their psychological manipulation methods to maintain effectiveness on populations that have been systematically conditioned since childhood. This creates an arms race between manipulation techniques and psychological resistance that drives innovation in religious exploitation. Churches compete to develop more powerful methods for manufacturing spiritual experiences. Theological schools establish research programs focused on enhanced spiritual effectiveness. Religious conferences feature presentations on advanced pastoral psychology that would horrify their Victorian predecessors with their calculated sophistication. The network effect accelerates exponentially as trained manipulators move between different religious organizations, cross-pollinating techniques and refining methods through exposure to diverse populations. A Methodist minister trained in Ashford's methods might move to a Baptist church, adapting his techniques to Baptist theology. A Catholic priest exposed to Protestant manipulation methods might integrate them with traditional Catholic practices. A Presbyterian pastor might carry learned techniques to a missionary position in Africa or Asia. By 1900, virtually every major Christian denomination in America and Europe has been infiltrated by manipulation techniques originally developed by survivors of the Victorian bleeding statue scandal. The methods have become so thoroughly integrated into standard religious practice that they're invisible even to their practitioners, who genuinely believe they're engaged in authentic ministry rather than systematic psychological exploitation. But the most chilling aspect of this mainstream infiltration is how it transforms entire religious cultures. Communities that were once served by churches focused on traditional theological education, community service, and spiritual guidance find themselves unknowingly participating in sophisticated psychological manipulation systems designed to create and exploit spiritual dependency. Church attendance patterns change from voluntary participation to compulsive behavior. Religious donation patterns shift from charitable giving to what resembles addiction-driven spending. Community religious activities evolve from supportive fellowship to competitive spiritual experience seeking. Traditional religious holidays become opportunities for intensive psychological manipulation rather than cultural celebration. The techniques prove so effective at increasing church engagement and financial contributions that they spread through religious institutions like a virus, carried by ministers, missionaries, and religious educators who don't understand the true nature of what they're propagating. Each successful implementation validates the methods and encourages further adoption, creating a self-reinforcing cycle of expanding manipulation. Dr. Morrison's later research documents how entire geographic regions can become saturated with religious manipulation techniques, creating communities where authentic spiritual experience becomes virtually impossible because every religious institution employs some variation of manufactured transcendence method. People seeking genuine faith find themselves trapped in environments where all available religious options involve systematic psychological exploitation. The academic study of religion begins recognizing patterns that suggest widespread manipulation, but the techniques have become so thoroughly integrated into mainstream practice that exposing them would require dismantling large portions of established religious infrastructure. The cure threatens to be more disruptive than the disease, creating institutional resistance to investigation or reform. Government authorities, meanwhile, struggle with constitutional questions about regulating religious practices that appear to involve psychological manipulation. How do you prosecute spiritual exploitation that uses legal techniques and produces satisfied customers? How do you protect religious freedom while preventing systematic psychological abuse disguised as ministry? The legal system proves completely inadequate for addressing manipulation techniques that operate through emotional rather than physical coercion, that create psychological dependency rather than obvious harm, and that are practiced by respected religious authorities rather than obvious criminals. The victims themselves often defend their manipulators, having been conditioned to interpret exploitation as authentic spiritual care. By the dawn of the 20th century, the techniques pioneered by desperate Victorian priests, bleeding marble statues, have evolved into a comprehensive system for manufacturing and exploiting human spiritual needs that operates throughout mainstream religious institutions. The bleeding statues were crude prototypes. Modern religious manipulation represents the fully developed product. The most successful spiritual manipulation is invisible to its victims, indistinguishable from authentic religious experience, and practiced by people who genuinely believe they're serving God rather than exploiting human psychological vulnerabilities. The perfect crime against human spirituality doesn't look like a crime at all. And every time you wonder why intelligent people fall for televangelists, megachurch pastors, or charismatic spiritual leaders, remember Dr. Morrison's research findings. When manipulation techniques become standard religious practice, the entire culture of faith becomes a hunting ground for those who understand how to manufacture the transcendence that humans desperately crave. You want to know how Victorian priests' bleeding marble statues connect directly to the spiritual manipulation you see every single day in the 21st century? How the desperate schemes of men like Father Whitmore and Reverend Ashford created the blueprint for every megachurch, prosperity gospel, and charismatic movement that exploits human spiritual hunger today? Prepare yourself for the most disturbing revelation of all. They never stopped. They just got better. The techniques that infiltrated mainstream Christianity by 1900 didn't disappear with the Victorian era. They evolved through 2 world wars, the Great Depression, the rise of mass media, and the digital revolution. Each generation of religious leaders inherited and refined the psychological manipulation methods without understanding their origins, creating an unbroken chain of spiritual exploitation that stretches from bleeding stone Madonnas to today's streaming megachurch services. The first major evolution comes during the 1920s with the emergence of radio evangelism. Preachers trained in Ashford-derived techniques discover that electronic media amplifies their psychological manipulation methods in ways their predecessors could never imagine. Reverend Harold Thompson, broadcasting from Chicago, reaches millions of listeners using voice modulation techniques originally developed to create altered states of consciousness in small frontier congregations. Thompson's radio sermons employ the same psychological manipulation principles documented in Ashford's training manuals: carefully timed emotional escalation, strategic use of silence and repetition, specific vocal rhythms that induce trance states, and personalized messages that make each listener believe they're receiving individual divine communication. But radio allows him to affect thousands of people simultaneously, creating economies of scale that the Victorian bleeding statue network could never achieve. The financial results are staggering. Thompson's radio ministries generates more donations in 1 year than Ashford's entire church network collected in a decade. Letters pour in from listeners describing profound spiritual experiences triggered by his broadcasts, providing testimonials more convincing than any bleeding statue could produce. And unlike physical miracles that can be investigated and debunked, radio-induced spiritual experiences leave no material evidence for skeptics to analyze. By the 1930s, radio evangelists across America are unknowingly employing psychological manipulation techniques that trace directly back to the Victorian bleeding statue survivors. They use the same principles of customized revelation, systematically studying their audiences, demographics, and tailoring messages to specific psychological vulnerabilities. They maintain detailed databases of listener correspondence, tracking individual spiritual needs and financial capacity with precision that would make Reverend Ashford proud. The techniques prove so effective that they begin spreading to secular applications. Political leaders hire former radio evangelists as speechwriters and campaign managers. Advertising agencies recruit ministers trained in religious manipulation to develop consumer marketing strategies. Entertainment companies study evangelical broadcasting techniques to enhance audience engagement with radio dramas and music programs. World War II accelerates the integration of religious manipulation techniques with mass media psychology. Military psychological warfare researchers study evangelical broadcasting methods, recognizing their potential for propaganda and morale manipulation. Post-war consumer culture adopts techniques originally developed for spiritual exploitation, creating advertising and entertainment industries that operate on psychological manipulation principles pioneered in Victorian church basements. The 1950s television evangelism explosion represents the next major evolution. Preachers like Oral Roberts and Billy Graham unknowingly employ visual and auditory manipulation techniques directly descended from Ashford's experiential faith architecture. Their stage lighting, camera angles, music selection, and audience management strategies all derive from psychological manipulation principles developed by bleeding statue network survivors. But television introduces new dimensions of manipulation impossible in earlier eras. Close-up camera work allows evangelists to establish intimate psychological connections with viewers, creating parasocial relationships that feel more personal than face-to-face interaction. Carefully edited broadcasts can eliminate mistakes and enhance emotional impact beyond what live performance achieves. Most disturbing of all, television allows manipulation techniques to enter people's homes, creating controlled environments for spiritual exploitation that victims create themselves. Dr. Margaret Thorne, a psychologist studying television's effects on religious behavior, documents concerning patterns in families that regularly watch evangelical programming. Children raised with constant exposure to televised religious manipulation show psychological profiles identical to those documented by Dr. Whitefield in the 1890s. Inability to experience authentic emotions without manufactured religious context, anxiety disorders when separated from spiritual stimulation, and addiction-like dependency on regular doses of electronic transcendence. Thorne's research reveals that television evangelism has created the first generation of people who experience manufactured spirituality as their primary form of religious engagement. These viewers don't attend traditional churches or participate in community religious activities. Instead, they seek increasingly dramatic, televised spiritual experiences that provide the psychological manipulation they've been conditioned to require. The 1970s and 1980s witnessed the emergence of what becomes known as the prosperity gospel movement, which represents the ultimate evolution of Victorian bleeding statue economics. Preachers like Kenneth Copeland and Benny Hinn employ psychological manipulation techniques to convince audiences that financial donations will produce miraculous returns, using the same principles of manufactured hope and systematic exploitation pioneered by Father Whitmore's network. The prosperity gospel's genius lies in creating self-reinforcing delusion systems where victims interpret their financial losses as spiritual investments and their continued poverty as proof of insufficient faith. This psychological framework, originally developed to explain why bleeding statue miracles didn't actually solve people's problems, has been refined into a comprehensive theology that immunizes believers against evidence of their exploitation. Modern megachurch architecture represents the physical manifestation of manipulation techniques developed over more than a century. Churches like Joel Osteen's Lakewood Church employ lighting, acoustics, seating arrangements, and environmental controls that create optimal conditions for psychological manipulation. Every design element serves the same purpose as Ashford's experiential faith architecture, maximizing audience vulnerability to manufactured spiritual experiences. The most disturbing aspect of contemporary religious manipulation is how digital technology has enabled techniques that the Victorian bleeding statue network could never imagine. Churches maintain detailed databases of member psychology profiles, tracking individual spiritual needs, financial capacity, personal crises, and manipulation, susceptibility with algorithmic precision. Social media allows religious leaders to deliver customized spiritual content directly to individual followers, creating personalized manipulation experiences that feel divinely inspired. Megachurch pastors use data analytics to optimize sermon content for maximum emotional impact and financial return. They track which topics generate the most donations, which emotional manipulation techniques produce the strongest audience responses, and which individual members are most vulnerable to specific types of spiritual exploitation. The Victorian priests' handwritten congregation files have evolved into sophisticated customer relationship management systems, designed to maximize spiritual manipulation efficiency. But here's the most chilling connection between Victorian bleeding statues and contemporary religious manipulation. The same families that were exploited by the original network continue to be victimized by its evolved descendants. Genealogical research reveals that many people caught up in modern prosperity, gospel, and megachurch movements are direct descendants of families who lost money, health, and lives to bleeding statue frauds in the 1860s and 1870s. The psychological vulnerability to spiritual manipulation appears to be transmitted across generations, creating family lines of people who remain susceptible to the same exploitation techniques that destroyed their ancestors. Children raised in households that experienced religious manipulation carry psychological imprints that make them ideal targets for future spiritual predators, employing evolved versions of identical techniques. Dr. Amanda Richardson's contemporary research into religious manipulation psychology documents how modern victims exhibit symptoms identical to those observed in Victorian bleeding statue congregations: financial desperation leading to irrational spiritual investments, health problems ignored in favor of faith, healing, social isolation created by exclusive religious communities, and psychological dependency on manufactured transcendent experiences. The cycle of exploitation has become so thoroughly integrated into American religious culture that most victims don't recognize their manipulation as abnormal. Techniques that would have shocked Victorian society as obvious fraud are now standard practice in thousands of churches across America. What once required elaborate mechanical devices and dangerous chemical mixtures now operates through psychological manipulation so sophisticated that it's invisible even to its practitioners. The streaming revolution and COVID-19 pandemic have accelerated the evolution of religious manipulation into forms that would terrify the Victorian bleeding statue network with their power and reach. Online religious services allow spiritual predators to access global audiences, maintain detailed digital profiles of individual followers, and deliver personalized manipulation content with unprecedented precision and scale. Virtual reality religious experiences represent the next frontier, promising to create manufactured spiritual phenomena more convincing than anything possible in physical reality. The technology exists to create completely artificial religious environments that trigger authentic neurological responses, producing spiritual experiences that feel absolutely real while remaining entirely manufactured. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this entire historical evolution is how the original victims of Victorian bleeding statue fraud would recognize and understand contemporary religious manipulation immediately. The techniques have grown more sophisticated, the technology has advanced dramatically, and the scale has expanded exponentially. But the fundamental psychological exploitation remains identical. The same desperation that drove Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell to kneel before Father Whitmore's bleeding Madonna drives people to send their life savings to televised prosperity preachers. The same manufactured hope that filled St. Bartholomew's Church with poisonous crowds fills modern megachurches with people seeking miracles that will never come. The same psychological manipulation that created spiritual addiction in Victorian congregations operates in contemporary religious movements with mechanical precision. The bleeding stone tears that once flowed through London churches have become digital streams of manufactured transcendence that flow through fiber optic cables into millions of homes. The copper tubing that carried fake blood through marble veins has evolved into psychological manipulation techniques that carry manufactured spirituality directly into human consciousness. Father Marcus Whitmore died believing his bleeding Madonna spoke to him directly, unable to distinguish between his own deception and divine revelation. Today's religious leaders suffer identical psychological deterioration, creating increasingly elaborate spiritual theatrics while losing touch with any authentic connection to the divine they claim to represent. The Victorian bleeding statue network represented humanity's first industrial-scale attempt to manufacture and exploit spiritual experience. Every religious manipulation you see today, from prosperity, gospel televangelists, to megachurch entertainment spectacles, to online spiritual influencers, represents the continued evolution of that original system. The statues stopped bleeding, but the exploitation never ended. It just learned to hide inside the human heart where no investigator could find the tubing, no chemist could analyze the blood, and no exposure could stop the flow. And next time you see people defending obvious spiritual fraudsters, sending money to wealthy preachers, or chasing increasingly dramatic religious experiences, remember this: they're not stupid, gullible, or weak. They're responding to psychological manipulation techniques refined over more than 150 years to exploit the deepest human need for meaning, hope, and transcendence. The bleeding statues of Victorian London were just the beginning. The real miracle is how effectively we've learned to bleed the human soul while convincing our victims that the hemorrhage is healing.